The Sanskrit alphabet, the Varṇamālā, organizes its consonants into a highly structured, standard 5x5 grid. Traditional linguistics views this layout as a phonetic classification system. It charts sound production according to the place and manner of articulation, moving from guttural sounds produced in the throat down to labial sounds formed at the lips. For the physical shapes of these letters, the accepted historical model relies on material constraints. The rigid, angular geometry of early scripts is often attributed to the difficulty of carving in ancient rock. When writing technology shifted to softer, more fluid mediums like palm leaves, the characters acquired rounded, curved forms to prevent the leaves from tearing. But this creates a mechanical inconsistency. If tools and materials changed constantly across centuries, the structural geometry of the vowels and consonants should have fractured into arbitrary variations. Instead, specific core geometries stabilized across the entire script. Administrative standardization and writing tools explain graphic style, but they do not account for structural permanence. To understand why these exact shapes walked into place, we must evaluate the script as a system with an internal structural tendency. In systems theory, teleology describes behavior organized toward a specific goal. It functions like a guidance system, adjusting trajectory based on continuous feedback to ensure it hits a precise destination. A new structural analysis proposes that the evolution of the Devanagari script is an active teleological feedback loop. Rather than adapting randomly to external pressures, the script organized itself to visually reflect Indic philosophical language theories. The foundation of this philosophy relies on two opposing mechanics. First is involution, the process where pure consciousness descends and binds itself into dense matter. The inverse process is evolution, where that involved consciousness gradually untangles and liberates itself from physical form. This diagram details the thesis. It treats the script as an engineered system, where specific phonetic sounds and their corresponding letter geometries act as a metric. The script form measures the descent into matter and the subsequent evolution back into consciousness. Viewing the alphabet as a self-organizing system explains its long-term stability. The shapes persisted because the language community continually refined the characters to match a specific philosophical blueprint. This engineering schematic shows a standard feedback control system. You start with an input, U, producing an output, Y. Comparing Y against a desired state, D, generates an error signal, E, correcting the system. We can map historical philology directly onto this control loop. The initial input, U, maps to the ancient seers. The desired state, D, represents the ideal of structural coherence, the geometric expression of involution and evolution. Applying this framework, the actual written characters represent the system output. That output is constantly measured against the philosophical ideal. When crude writing materials distort the letter forms, it creates an error signal. This deviation generates pressure within the linguistic community, forcing a cycle of structural adjustments to the characters. The physical alphabet is the artifact of that process. It is a record of a system converging over centuries on its intended structural geometry. To test this hypothesis, we examine the geometry of the characters, beginning with the script's foundational axiom, the primary root vowel A. This table maps the drawing of A to the 9 saktis, the specific powers in the overmind plane of consciousness. Every stroke corresponds to a distinct stage of creation. In the upper hemisphere, the shape consists of curling half spirals. These strokes signify the descending creative power of involution, consciousness turning inward and downward toward manifestation. In the lower hemisphere, fluid curves stop. A rigid horizontal line connects to a firm vertical bar. This geometry signifies the finality of manifestation, where that descending energy takes a fixed stand in matter. The visual components of A establish the geometric rules for the alphabet. Spirals represent consciousness evolving. Rigid knots and bars represent matter taking form. We can trace these established rules across the 5x5 consonantal grid to see if the characters physically untangle themselves as the sounds evolve. This matrix analyzes the structural characteristics of the consonants. We start with the guttural ka, representing the absolute culmination of involution, the densest point of physical matter. The anatomy of ka follows the rule, featuring a prominent left spiral for the mind and a closed right knot for life bound in matter. As the grid moves horizontally through the aspirated and soft consonants, the physical geometry unfolds. Dense knots break open, and the shapes rise vertically. By the time the row reaches the nasal na, the letter achieves a full structural unknotting. The element representing physical containment is completely dissolved. The linguistics of the spoken word and the geometry of the written letter operate in tandem. The transition from vocal occlusion to phonetic release is mirrored by the graphic transition from a closed knot to an open line. This chart divides the entire Varṇamālā into a vertical hierarchy, expanding the unknotting principle across the full spectrum of sounds. The 5x5 consonantal grid populates the lower hemisphere. This is the domain of dense, involved matter, where characters feature heavy loops and tight central knots. Moving upward, the system hits a boundary layer containing pa and ma. At this threshold, the structures undergo a graphic inversion. The shapes open at the top, preparing to cross into the medials. Above this boundary lies the higher hemisphere semivowels. Characters like ya and va feature liberated geometries, exhibiting open, linear forms indicative of integrative consciousness. The entire matrix operates as a coordinate map. From top to bottom, the lines trace consciousness descending into density, and from bottom to top, the shapes unfold back into openness. By applying these underlying teleological rules, the seemingly complex geometry of the Devanagari script resolves into a perfectly ordered system. The block diagram proves its utility. Phonetic flow, structural design, and philosophical concepts are integrated through a continuous feedback loop. The implication is strict. The Varṇamālā provides a physical recording of a system converging on its structural ideal. Sri Aurobindo described this synthesis in his poem Savitri, writing that we must re-wed the closed finite's lonely consonant with the open vowels of infinity, requiring a hyphen to connect matter and mind. The geometry of the Sanskrit alphabet satisfies that requirement. It demonstrates that ancient Indian thought engineered a precise structural bridge between visual form, sound, cognition, and cosmology.